Welcome to Will I Ever Learn Chinese? I'm Jeanette Sakel. In this episode, I'm looking at revision at the intermediate level, doing vocab, and then starting to speak for real. Much of my initial language learning had involved curating the right learning environment for myself and constantly evaluating what I was doing. I was now reaching a stage where it was time to go over some of my earlier learning again, as I realized that there were quite a few words that I had known at the beginning that I could no longer recall. As I was progressing, I had streamlined my methods by compiling vocabulary resources, and I was keen to add the earlier vocabulary so that I would have everything in one place. This would make it easier to revise everything I thought, and hopefully this process would be relatively straightforward. Two of the areas I really wanted to revisit were pronunciation and vocabulary. With respect to the pronunciation, I had come such a long way in understanding the sound contrasts of the language, feeling more at home understanding and speaking Chinese. I realized that there was quite a lot of the pronunciation that I had not really grasped at the beginning. There was also some of the pronunciation that I had misunderstood. To review the pronunciation and build on what I had previously learned, I listened again to the entire audio companion of my learning program, taking notes of things I wanted to look at in more detail. I also wrote down all the words I wanted to revise, some that I had not fully grasped yet, forgotten again, did not know how to write, or just felt I needed to learn a bit more in order to be able to use them in context. When I first started learning with my gamified learning approach, I didn't write down any vocabulary lists at all. I was just playing the game. But it soon became apparent that I needed to write down some words, because I couldn't always remember them immediately. So I did what I was used to from learning other languages before, and I bought a small set of index cards to help me do vocab, as I called it. I had used this method many times, so I would put a word in English on one side and then the Chinese word with the characters on the other side. That way I could test myself. I could go through the box of index cards and look at the English and then see if I remembered the Chinese, or look at the Chinese and then see if I remembered the English, and so on. From now on, I was always carrying a keyring with index cards around with me, and I regularly checked these and rearranged them depending on how my learning was going. I had to be quite organized though, so remember to go over those that I had previously learned and then remembered. But, after a week or so, you can forget them again. So I had to do spaced repetition, as it's called. I had to learn and relearn again and again. And it was starting to become a bit cumbersome, because some days I would write 30, 40, 50 new words a day, sometimes up to 200 new words a day. And I would not have time to do all these flashcards to learn them all and remember to go over the things I had learned previously as well. And this is when I noticed that my dictionary app had a vocabulary extension. I had to pay a one-off fee, and then I could use the app to save all those words that I didn't know and add them to folders and repeat them at regular intervals. There were a lot of settings, and the app would take care of the intervals at which I wanted to learn the words. I no longer had to remember this myself. So I started to move on from index cards to the electronic way to do vocab. There were several added advantages, such as playing the pronunciation of the words I was learning or looking up similar words alongside. However, despite the time saved, I missed writing words on index cards, as this was a really good way to carefully consider what a character looked like. I felt that merely adding new words to my app, I would not always be fully aware of the intricacies of each character and how it's written. Overall, however, the app had many advantages, and I decided that I would write Chinese characters at other times in other contexts, by copying stories or writing my own texts, trying to use the new words I had learned. Learning those new words was not always straightforward, however. Some people seemingly pick up new vocabulary by looking at it once, but I'm definitely not one of those people. Each new word had to be learned, and I often had to encounter a new word several times before I had an inkling of its meaning, let alone being able to use it myself. I noticed that there were words I was looking up again and again and again in my app because I had added them to some of the folders I had previously set up. Trying to be conscious of these words that I apparently was not able to learn, I started to listen out for them in television dramas and in podcasts. And suddenly they would miraculously appear. There would be other words I had only a semi-grasp on, and I would suddenly understand them. Sometimes I'd think, I've learned this word not that long ago. What does it mean? My learning, it seemed, needed to go through a number of iterations, and only when I came across words in other contexts would I progress in my learning, while learning new words in isolation almost never worked. It would be great if we could just watch television and learn new words that way, wouldn't it? But again, that didn't work for me either. I needed to have a bit of input first, looking up words in a dictionary, becoming aware of the word and its meaning, and encountering it in context, but then I also had to use the word. Sometimes I stopped looking up new words for a few days, and I really felt something was missing. Using a dictionary, trying to remember new vocabulary keeps the language growing. Hearing words in context and eventually using them yourself will seal the deal. I would encounter topics in television series or podcasts that I was particularly interested in. I watched or listened to the relevant episodes a few times and then tried to use my own words to describe what I had learned, using the new vocabulary in context. Since I like gardening, I re-watched scenes in a television series, learning words such as organic and fresh. I learned about zhong, to grow and sow, and cai, to harvest. I noticed later, when I was getting much better at the language, that I would more easily pick up new vocabulary in context. So once I was able to understand the majority of what was said, new words would blend into the background, and I would notice them, but I would use my imagination to understand what they could mean. Sometimes I made up elaborate stories in my mind, and sometimes I would get the meaning slightly wrong, but most of the time I understood just fine and I was able to move on, eventually learning to use the new words in context when I was speaking. This is why when learning new words, using materials that are just above your level of understanding can be helpful. We discussed this when we talked about comprehensible input. But input alone is not enough. We need to speak. While growing my overall vocabulary this way worked well, I sometimes needed specific words for specific contexts. Sometimes I wanted to talk to others about the Sinitic language family, for example. Sometimes running an examination board with a Chinese partner university, I would want to know how to express pass rates and similar. I wouldn't necessarily find these words in television series, so I needed another way of learning new and very specialized or situational vocabulary. In these cases, I started to find materials online, and I also started to put together word lists with the most likely words I could come across in specific scenarios. I would then learn these words on the list and try to formulate scenarios in my mind where I was using the relevant vocabulary in context. To be honest, learning this way can be very useful, but when you've only just learned something, you may not necessarily be able to use the word straight away in that context, no matter how much you wished you were. Learning goes round in stages, and you have to repeat something various times before it's really going to stick. And this is particularly true for learning languages. But the more you get aware of the words you get exposed to, the easier it will be for you to use them yourself eventually. I was learning more words and sentences, and my understanding of spoken Mandarin improved. I was also learning to read and to a lesser degree write the language. Yet the one area where I was still falling short was speaking. In my head, Chinese was great, but I could just not put together those elaborate conversations when I was actually speaking. My brain would go into overdrive. I'd say weird things. I'd hesitate. Sometimes I wasn't even able to speak at all. That made me quite reluctant to approach Chinese speakers. I realized that there were a few situations where I could use my Chinese in daily life if I would wish to do so. For example, at a school event, I was standing next to the mum of one of my daughter's friends, who is of Chinese heritage. I smiled and chatted away in English, while a little demon at the back of my mind dared me to speak Chinese. But I just couldn't get myself to do it just yet. At times, the realization that I could speak Chinese, but not daring to do so, led to some hilarious situations. One day, a fellow allotment holder told me that he had found a bird's nest in his shed. When I saw that his Chinese wife was there as well, I thought that this was the perfect opportunity to try out my new language skills. But I needed a little bit of time to ready myself, so I went to my own allotment, hiding behind my shed, realizing that I neither knew the word for nest nor the word for shed. What to do? Well, I looked them up in my dictionary app, and I constructed a few sentences in my head that I could use to speak with the wife. By the time I had finally mustered up enough courage to walk over to their plot, they had left. I realized that I needed more vocabulary and I needed to speak more in order to confidently approach Chinese people and speak to them in Chinese. I also needed more fixed phrases to make my spoken language more fluent. But most importantly, I needed to get over that initial hurdle of speaking the language. I needed to get my brain in gear. Because I struggled to start conversations in Chinese with the people around me, mainly because my proficiency was still quite low and I sometimes didn't dare, I found methods that didn't involve people. And these were my cat and artificial intelligence. My cat did not seemingly judge me, despite what internet memes tell us about cats' appreciation or not of humans. But he looked slightly confused, if anything, when I started to speak to him in Chinese. He must have gotten used to the intonation and sounds of English, and suddenly I was making rather different sounds. But he soon realized that Chefanle, let's eat, produced food. So he seemed happy enough with the deal. As I had been speaking English with him before, there were certain words that he appeared to recognize, such as his name, treats, but sadly also vet, making it slightly challenging to catch him before each annual vaccination appointment. In return, he was using basic sign language to communicate with me, such as when asking for food he'd come up to me, look at me and lick his lips. Because I was speaking to him, he'd also use his own meows to speak back at me. At first, my speaking ability, even with my cat, was rather rusty, but it soon picked up. I learned specific phrases associated with my daily communication with my cat, such as, "Your belly is very fluffy." Well, these sort of expressions are not necessarily very useful in other contexts. Despite having this restriction, just speaking Chinese helped me enormously to feel comfortable speaking the language out loud. I started to speak to my cat about the things I was encountering. I tried to explain to him how to prepare a meal and the like, all in Chinese. I got a lot out of speaking Chinese to my cat. Rather than just thinking up words and sentences in my head, I was speaking the language out loud, having to make choices for words, hearing my own pronunciation, all while getting used to speaking out loud. Some of the mistakes I was making at first were soon ironed out. I realized which sounds I struggled with and worked on them. This was all away from other people who would potentially judge me. The more I spoke, the more natural did my Chinese become. I could suddenly just say something in Chinese without thinking too much about it. I realized another interesting thing. I've always talked to my cats. Perhaps not as much as I was doing now, but I definitely did say things like "dinner is ready" before to other cats. Thinking back to the languages I had been speaking to my previous cats, this always depended on the setting. I lived back in Germany for a few years after being in Denmark, when I adopted my first cat. I was still speaking Danish as my main daily language, so when speaking to my cat, I automatically spoke Danish to her. I adopted my next cat many years later, and I was automatically speaking English to her. Yet I caught myself sometimes saying the odd, endearing Danish word to her. Danish was still, at the back of my mind, the language I would use with cats. Thus, there is something about the language you're immersed in, a language taking charge of the talk to animals function. And as I immersed myself deeper into Chinese, talking Chinese to animals became the norm, and I would automatically speak Chinese to any animals I encountered, like my friends' dogs. The next venture into the world of speaking Chinese was with my phone, more specifically with voice recognition apps. I set my phone AI assistant to Mandarin and would ask it to set my alarm or to look something up in the dictionary, but quite often it would respond with not knowing what I was going on about and asking me to repeat my question. At times, it would set the alarm at a different time to the one requested. Obviously, my pronunciation wasn't great yet, and I had some way to go, but also it was a very one-sided conversation, and unlike my cat licking his lips, the AI assistant never spoke back to inquire how I was doing, or asking for treats for that matter. I kept my AI assistant set to Chinese and used it on occasion, but not as much as talking to my cat. However, as I was progressing, a natural language processing chatbot that had hitherto only worked with the written language had launched a spoken language facility, and Chinese was amongst the languages that it spoke very well. I had some fascinating conversations with it. I could play around with formal and informal language. I could ask what certain expressions I kept hearing meant and the like. At times, it would randomly switch to a Taiwanese accent, which I found hilarious. Once it switched, and it was probably speaking back to me in Cantonese. I can't be 100% sure, but that's what it sounded like. I came across a discussion on an online forum about introverts learning a language, being uncomfortable talking to others. I shared my experiences about talking to my pet, and others were using this approach as well, it seemed. AI was mentioned as well. There's something exciting about learning a language quite well in secret and then emerging speaking that language fluently. Eventually, though, every learner has to go through a phase of speaking while making mistakes to learn to speak the language well. There is no harm in building up a good knowledge base first, though, which is what I was attempting in my learning of Chinese. One can say that if you're in the country, you can learn a language very quickly. Of course, it depends a lot on the situation, but when I was living in Denmark, my Danish developed so much quicker than I would have been able to achieve while living in Germany. This was because I had the need to communicate. I was forced to use the language, as it was the language I was studying in. I was able to learn expressions there and then as I was hearing the language around me all the time, but crucially, I was also speaking the language all the time. The people I was speaking to were expecting me to speak Danish, so I didn't necessarily have a choice, as with Chinese when I was learning Chinese in Britain, where the default language I would have to speak to others was almost always English. Living in a country and learning a language this way can be very rewarding, but also very straining. It is sometimes called the sink or swim approach. While I managed to swim, just about, many people sink and give up altogether. When learning a language from afar, there is usually less pressure to perform in the language. This obviously depends greatly on the setting. One does not have to be able to swim straight away. The learner can take it easy, following the learning style that is most motivating. Rather than giving up something because it seems too difficult, they can adjust their learning style. They can also keep their new language to themselves for the time being, as I was doing, while building up a base from which they can speak the language more comfortably. And once I had built up that base, I felt more comfortable speaking Chinese and starting a conversation in Chinese. My chance to get out of my comfort zone came in an unexpected way. I was traveling to Boston to give a presentation at a workshop in nearby Cambridge in honor of a former colleague. I had lined up some vocabulary revision and writing practice for my flight, wearing noise-cancelling headphones. This kept me engaged for a few hours, and I managed to get through a lot of learning and revision that I otherwise would not have done in this way. It also kept me fully immersed in the language. I was thinking in Chinese when I got off the plane in Boston, imagining I had just arrived at a Chinese airport. I was rather jet-lagged and spent the next few days in a zoned-out state, a bit like being slightly drunk. At the research event after my presentation, a range of PhD students came up to me to ask me questions about my research. It turned out that most of them were Chinese, so I said a few words in Chinese to them. They were quite thrown that I could speak their language and were intrigued how I'd learned it. Later that evening, I was able to hitch a lift with some of the students on the way to the celebratory dinner, and we chatted away in the car. That is, I chatted in quite rudimentary, broken Chinese, interspersed with code switching into English when necessary. We picked up another student on the way who did not know that I could speak the language and jumped slightly when I spoke. Nobody seemed to mind me speaking quite badly at this stage. They were all pleasantly surprised and happy to speak back to me. I, on the other hand, did not feel as intimidated as I had done during my previous encounters with Chinese speakers. I was in a foreign country, away from home life responsibilities, so I let my inhibitions go a little. Also, I had just proven my worth by presenting my research, and the students were interested in that research, so they were keen to talk to me anyway, even though my Chinese wasn't great yet. We talked to each other for a few hours during the dinner and on the way back. I had finally started speaking with actual people. Not only did they help me pick up a lot of useful expressions, the students also gave me some suggestions as what else I could do in Boston during the next few days. There was a Dragon Boat Festival, for example, which sounded interesting. It turned out there were a lot of Chinese speakers in Boston. I heard it spoken all around me. At the Dragon Boat Festival, I sat down under a tree in welcome shade amongst dozens of people, and I was listening in on their conversations. Sometimes I understood what I was hearing, sometimes I didn't. I wondered whether some of the speakers were speaking Cantonese as well. But some of the things I did understand around me were great. An older man said to a toddler, "Let's call Grandma now and tell her that we'll be coming home soon." Then he progressed to calling his wife. I listened in, amazed by how much I was suddenly understanding. I was feeling slightly cheeky and undercover, just sitting there and listening in on other people's conversations. But at the same time, I was incredibly proud of myself that I was able to understand so much of what was being said. On the way home, I was again using the journey to revise my Chinese learning to date. It was great as I could sit in my little bubble, have my noise-cancelling headphones on and just relax, drifting in and out of sleep and then continuing to learn some more vocab. When there isn't anything else to do, this is a brilliant method to learn. It kept my mind occupied as well. I could escape to an inner world away from the noisy airport around me. On the last leg of my journey from Amsterdam to Bristol, I stopped my learning to look out of the window. The man in the seat next to me turned towards me and asked me what specific program I was using to learn Mandarin. We started to talk, and it turned out that he as well was learning Mandarin. He had some good advice for certain tools that I had previously not come across, while I shared my experiences with the language. It turned out that he was on his way to a linguistics conference in the UK, and while he was in a different subfield, we soon realized that we had various acquaintances in common. It's funny how Mandarin can lead to such encounters, as we would unlikely have talked to one another otherwise and would never have found out about each other's shared friends and colleagues. Boston was great for speaking some Chinese, but despite my successes of speaking, I realized that there was still a way to go before I would be comfortable speaking the language and initiating conversations in Chinese. But I had now finally embraced that last hurdle of speaking. I was ready to go on to the next stage of learning and to find new ways to help me in my quest.